Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor. And today, we're going to be doing my top 10 favorite fantasy books. You know, after I did my science fiction list and my horror list, that this was coming. My top 10 fantasy books. So, yeah. I like fantasy. Now, this is the list that is most likely to change over time because, of course, we live in the new golden age of fantasy fiction. Fantasy fiction is huge now. There's more being written all the time, and a lot of it is really, really good. So I still have a lot to read in fantasy. I still haven't read Brandon Sanderson, for example, at all. I know. What's wrong with me? And I still haven't read The Wheel of Time. Those are both things I wanted to get to this year and just haven't and probably won't. And yeah, but I do have several favorites from the fantasy that I've read throughout the years. So here is my top 10. Now I'm going to make them magically appear here, floating in the air, by using an advanced and complicated magic system, which if I ever write a novel about my life, it will be a fantasy novel and I'll explain the magic system in great detail. But for right now, I'm going to leave it mysterious. So, I'm going to go 10 to 1, as we do in these lists. Least favorite to most favorite. I got them all written down so I don't screw up. So, number 10 is Lord Danzani. So Lord Danzani, classic fantasy. Lord Danzani, one of the earliest classic fantasy writers. He influenced so many people. Huge influence on H.P. Lovecraft, surprisingly enough. H.P. Lovecraft wrote a lot of fantasy, and it was all in the Danzani style, or inspired by Danzani. And he probably, almost certainly, inspired J.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. It's not anything like the Lord of the Rings, but I'm sure Tolkien read Lord Danzani, without a doubt. And there had to be a lot of influence there. I particularly like the Fantasy Masterworks edition of Time and the Gods, because it has a lot of stuff in there. Danzani came out with several slim volumes of stories that took place in a fantasy world with fantastic gods of his own creation and just all kinds of bizarre and fantastic situations and dangers and just brilliant stuff. Stylistically, it seemed to have been influenced mostly by the King James Bible. Brilliantly written, beautifully written stories. Not enough people read Lord Danzani now. I urge you to pick up some Lord Danzani. Easily available now because all of his stuff is in the public domain. So yeah, if you've got a Kindle, for example, boom, you can get it for nothing. And Penguin actually came out with a volume of Lord Danzani's stories. This one's my favorite though. So yeah, that was that. And now we're at number 9, which is going to be Neil Gaiman's American Gods. Neil Gaiman's American Gods, a fantasy story unlike any other you'll find on this list. Very unique fantasy American Gods. It's been really popular since it was published, and I really like this story. In fact, I got the annotated version of American Gods, and I was hoping to read that this year, but it's not looking good. My year is looking a little as far as getting to the stuff that I wanted to get to. But hopefully next year, I would like to read this book again. It's on the borderland between fantasy and horror fiction. It's unique into itself, and just a brilliant story of gods in the modern world. And if gods did exist in the modern world, what they would be like and why they would exist. And just a really interesting story. Like I said, pretty unique American Gods. If you haven't read it, you should read it. Don't worry about like the TV show that's on or the comic books or all that stuff. Just read the book. It's one book. It's a standalone book that you can read, and it's really good. So I urge you to read American Gods, a different kind of fantasy. So that was American Gods, which brings us to number 8. Number 8 is Legend by David Gemmell. I just talked about this because I just read this, and already it's on my top 10 list. It's that good. I liked this story an awful lot. Kind of loved this story, actually. The tale of a small group of warriors who are holding back a barbarian horde to preserve their empire, including Druss, the legend, the most badass of all badass warriors. It's great. It's a great book. I enjoyed it tremendously. Yeah, so Legend by David Gemmell. You check out that book. It's fantastic. And I'm really looking forward to reading the other books in the series and all the other books that David Gemmell wrote. So that was that. And now that brings us to number 7, which is She by H. Rider Haggard. I've talked about this book before too. When my BookTube channel was brand new, I talked about this. It was a Sunday Penguin that I did before I did Sunday Penguins. She by H. Rider Haggard. Fantastic fantasy story. A story of high adventure where some explorers enter a hidden kingdom, a lost world, and meet She, who must be obeyed. She, a fantastic character, a character that you'll never forget. Aisha, she who must be obeyed. Fantastic, magical character, both lovely and terrifying. I was impressed when I first read this, and I've reread it a couple times, and I always enjoy this book. Great book by H. Rider Haggard. Spawned a few sequels because it was that good, and very popular. They made it into, I think, a couple movies, although I don't think I've seen either one of them. No, I don't think I've seen either one of them, actually, which is surprising. I'll have to remedy that. One of them has Peter Cushing in it, I think. I don't know. But She is an awful good book. A different kind of fantasy, but it's definitely a fantasy. I don't think it can fall into any other category, really. So definitely check out She by H. Rider Haggard. A great classic fantasy. Yeah, so that was that, which brings us to number 6, which are the Kane saga by Carl Edward Wagner. Now, I'm just going to throw in all the novels and the stories. There weren't that many of them. There were enough to fill up a couple books, a couple hardback books that I was lucky enough to get. They're kind of hard to get now, but you can still get the old paperbacks if you want to jump on the eBay, and you can get the whole series as ebooks. They're still being sold as ebooks last time I checked. So yeah, if you've got a Kindle, you can read all of these, and you should, because these are dark fantasy stories, some of the best dark fantasy stories that have ever been written. Carl Edward Wagner was kind of a genius. He's kind of been, not totally forgotten, but sort of forgotten. Even people who have heard of this guy probably haven't read his books, and that should change. So I'm going to be talking more about Carl Edward Wagner and his dark saga of Kane, the immortal swordsman. This guy, he's no hero, this guy. Kind of an anti-hero, Kane. Even sort of a gothic villain, you might say. So yeah, gothic, horror, fantasy, the Kane saga. Again, fantasy unlike anything else, really. So yeah, that was that. So that brings us to number 5, which is going to be the First Law trilogy. I guess I could include all of the First Law books, really, but the First Law trilogy, definitely, by Joe Abercrombie. The trilogy that begins with the Blade itself. Fantastic fantasy trilogy. Everybody's heard of Joe Abercrombie, I think, by now. Brilliant set of books. My brother, the Duke, the Duke of Vaughan actually was trying to talk me into reading this for years because he was a big fan since it first came out, this series. And I was like, yeah, sure, whatever you say. And finally, the Duke gave me a copy to read and said, read this book. If the Duke tells you to do something, probably should do it. You know, he's always hanging out at Dark Castle Vaughan, coming up with villainous schemes to conquer the world. But yeah, he told me to read this book, and I did, and I'm glad I did, because this is a heck of a book and a great trilogy. Each book in the trilogy gets better, I think. This famously is the famous Grimdark trilogy, although I'm still a little unclear what Grimdark is. I'm not sure Joe Abercrombie even knows what Grimdark is. I have to ask Slowly Read. He would know. We'll ask him. He would know what Grimdark is. But me, I'm a little unsure. Because this is grim and dark, but it's also really, it has a lot of humor in it. It's dark humor, but there's a lot of humor in this series, which is one of the reasons it's so entertaining. It's funny, it's horrifying, it's exciting, it has great characters. The characters in these books, fantastic. Of course, Glokta is my favorite. I don't know how Glokta isn't everybody's favorite, but he might be everybody's favorite from this series of books. Great books, the First Law trilogy. So that brings us to number 4. What could it be? Gardens of the Moon by Steven Erikson. Now, I haven't read many of the Book of the Fallen novels. I've only read 2 so far. I was hoping to get to more of them this year, but they're long. And I got stuck reading every book by Stephen King and Frank Herbert and a bunch of others. So I've only read 2, and I probably won't read the next one until January or February. Because they're long, like I said. But Gardens of the Moon was great. It was a great introduction to this series. Dead House Gates was probably the better book quality-wise, but I like Gardens of the Moon better. Now, going into this series by Steven Erikson, it could be daunting. I think a lot of people have heard how difficult this series can be. I didn't have that much of a problem with it, although I see why people say this. He does level up fantasy. He makes everything is just so huge and amazing in this series. I mean, epic. It's epic, this book in this series. But the difficulty in this series, at least so far, is that he will introduce you to different races of people, different countries, different creatures, and he won't explain any of them, you know? You just kind of have to figure out stuff as you go along. Luckily, there's some stuff at the back of each book that'll tell you about all this stuff. So you just flip to like, what the hell is this? And you go to the back, oh, that's what that is. So it's not as difficult as you might think, particularly if you have a physical copy, which is what I would recommend for these. Yeah, but a great epic fantasy series that I'm really enjoying, even though I'm only 2 books in. 2 big books in. And they just keep getting bigger, these books. I'll be reading this series forever. It's a good thing. It's a darn good. I really like it. I was really impressed with Gardens of the Moon and Dead House Gates. Great fantasy series. Like I said, it levels up fantasy, this series. Amazing stuff. So, Gardens of the Moon, which brings us to number 3. Who else could it be but Elric? Michael Moorcock's Elric Saga. The Elric Saga. Another really unique series. A series that is just off the wall and strange with doomed Elric of Melniboné and his evil blade Stormbringer who sucks out your soul when he stabs you with it. He's by nature very weak. He needs drugs to keep him strong until he gets his hold of Stormbringer. Now, Elric is a magician sorcerer who is also a warrior, and he gets this dark blade Stormbringer, which gives him strength, you know, when he kills you with it. Ends up just killing folks he doesn't want to kill. He's just hanging out. And then, oh, sorry, man. My magic sword killed you. And now I'm sucking out your soul to give me strength. It's great, Elric. Michael Moorcock's a really interesting writer. This series is really interesting. It's kind of like the Conan series in that it wasn't, the stories weren't written or released in order. If you read them in order, the set I have happens to be in the order of publication, and that jumps all over the place. I mean, after the novel Stormbringer, you're like, geez, where can it go from here? It goes back in time, is what it does. I have on order this new set, and I'm not sure how it's going to be, whether it's going to be in publication order or chronological. Elric, if you can get a set that's in chronological order, it's probably better. It'll probably be less confusing. But any way you read Elric, Elric's great. The Eternal Champion, one of his aspects, Elric. Michael Moorcock wrote a lot of fantasy, and just about all of it's really worth reading. Really influential character, and not too many people have read Elric, believe it or not. Some of us old-timers have, but a lot of you young kids haven't read Elric, and you gotta change that. You gotta. Because Elric's magnificent. That brings us to number 2. What can it be? Probably not what you think. It's The Lord of the Rings. You're like, wait, isn't this number 1? Well, it's a list of my favorites, not a list of what's the best. If it was the best fantasy, okay, it's probably The Lord of the Rings. I'll give you that because it's amazing. The Lord of the Rings is incredible. Now, of course, when I talk about The Lord of the Rings, I always include The Hobbit, even though it has a different sort of style to it. It is the prelude to The Lord of the Rings, so I lump them all together. Like when I read The Lord of the Rings, I always read The Hobbit first, always. But Lord of the Rings, what else is there to say? This classic, beautifully written, epic story of a small band who take a evil magical ring and destroy it to defeat Sauron in Middle-earth. It's just incredible. It has fantastic characters in it. It's a brilliant novel. If you've only known Lord of the Rings from the films, they were good films. The book is better. There are some booktubers out there who have said the opposite. There are some booktubers out there who said the movies are actually better than the book. You're insane. Probably crazy. Sorry. If you think that the movies were better. I know there are no elves sliding down the front of giant elephants in the book. But to me, that's a plus. Call me crazy. The special effects are better in the book. It's great. It's an amazing novel. It's the real thing. I like the movies, don't get me wrong. I think that it's a brilliant adaptation. The movies, fantastic. Brilliant, yes, but it's not the book. The book is better. And the book is the real thing. So read the book. Read Lord of the Rings. I mean, if you're interested in fantasy at all, you have to read it. It's just that good. There are certain people who will disagree in the comments below. But it's incredible, Lord of the Rings. Which leaves you with number 1. What could number 1 be if that was number 2? Number 1 is my personal favorite fantasy of all time. My personal favorite. I know. Rhonda agrees with me that it is Conan the Barbarian. Yes, the Chronicles of Conan, created by Robert E. Howard, the greatest pulp writer who ever lived. Conan the Barbarian, the Sumerian warrior who came down out of Samaria as a young teenager, started off the lowest of the low, a thief in the streets, who worked his way up. He was a mercenary, he was a pirate, he was a general, he was a bunch of things, and eventually Conan became the king of the Hyborian Age. The king of Aquilonia, the greatest kingdom of his world. Conan is amazing. And Conan is not what you think it is. If you only know Conan from the comic book was fantastic, don't get me wrong. But if you only know Conan from the comic, or the films, forget those films. They were good. I liked Conan the Barbarian, the film, but it wasn't the book. It wasn't Robert E. Howard's Conan. Robert E. Howard's Conan is something else entirely. Not only is he the greatest warrior of his age, he was smart, Conan, which is one of the reasons he became king. And these stories can be dark, they can be uncompromising, they're full of action, they're full of adventure, beautiful language. It's pulp fiction, but it's the best pulp fiction. Robert E. Howard was an incredible talent. We lost him far too young, but thank goodness we got some great fantasy heroes. We got Solomon Kane, we got Bran McMorn, we got Kull, the king, and we also got the greatest of them all, Conan the Barbarian. My personal favorite fantasy of all, Conan. So that was my list. I hope you enjoyed it. I had to do fantasy after doing the other two lists for the last couple weeks. So catch me next time. Let's see, it's Friday. Is it Friday? What day is it? No, it's Saturday. This is Saturday that I do this. So tomorrow is going to be another Sunday Penguin, and it's going to be a good one. Yeah, it's going to be a good one. We're getting prepared for Halloween, so it might be kind of a dark and scary one this week. And it's probably not the dark and scary one you would expect. But so, check out the Sunday Penguin tomorrow. Okay, guys, you have a great day.